If you've seen The Lion King, you've seen Hamlet. Disney softened it, but Shakespeare did not. If you've seen The Godfather, Scarface, There Will Be Blood, Barry Lyndon, or any story about rise and fall driven by ego, you've seen Macbeth. Macbeth didn't just create stories of unchecked ambition, it created the very concept of unchecked ambition. Before Shakespeare, the hero usually survived. After him, no one was safe. He didn't just change stories. He changed the way we understand human beings. Phrases like, "Love is blind," "My blood runs cold," "Break the ice," "In the blink of an eye," and hundreds more were born from him. The charismatic villain that fascinates you, Shakespeare. Love that doesn't need a happy ending, Shakespeare. Ambition that devours itself, Shakespeare. That's why today you're going to see the best films that adapt or are directly inspired by Shakespeare. And at the end, a special mention to all those works that don't adapt a specific tragedy, but that, without Shakespeare, simply would not exist. Think about it for a second. When you watch a story about politics, betrayal, speeches that ignite crowds, and friends who turn into enemies, you're not watching modern cinema. You're watching him. Julius Caesar is one of the most important films ever made, not because it reinvents the language of cinema, but because it proves something essential: that the playwright's words already contained everything. Hollywood doesn't try to modernize it here. It does something harder. It listens. The story moves between Rome and the human heart. A charismatic leader, a betrayal born of conviction, and an entire city capable of turning in a matter of minutes. The plot revolves around power, but not power as victory, power as a moral problem. No one here is a simple villain, and no one walks away clean. The author's great achievement was understanding that politics is not a battle between good and evil, but between ideas, egos, and fears. And this film translates that into classical cinema with masterful clarity. There's something else. In the heart of classical Hollywood, Marlon Brando proves that you don't need to shout or overact to dominate a scene. Just a restrained voice and absolute conviction. That contrast between language and presence elevates the film to another level. The speeches are the core of the story, not as ornament, but as weapons. This is where modern political drama is born. The manipulation of the masses, the fragility of truth, and the ease with which an entire city can be pushed toward an irreversible fate. With Julius Caesar, Shakespeare invented modern political drama. The leader who drags everyone along, the traitor who believes he is doing the right thing, and the manipulator who understands something essential. Power belongs not to the one who is right, but to the one who controls the narrative. Sound familiar? Exactly. It all starts here. West Side Story is one of the most brilliant adaptations ever made because it achieves something almost impossible, turning Romeo and Juliet into popular culture without emptying it of meaning. There are no castles or swords here, but there is fate, inherited hatred, and a soulmate love born in the worst possible place. The film moves the story to the streets of New York while keeping the heart of the tragedy intact. Two young people trapped between forces they cannot control. What's fascinating is how cinema uses dance and music not to soften the tragedy, but to make it more physical, more urgent, more visceral. Every choreography is a conflict. Every song is a declaration of war or love. Here the playwright proved something cinema has repeated ever since. When the world is divided into sides, true love does not disappear or get replaced. It resists beyond life and time. There are no clear villains, only systems that push people toward disaster, and that remains painfully relevant. West Side Story is not just a great film. It is definitive proof that Shakespeare works in any era, any genre, and for any audience. When a story is eternal, the format doesn't matter. Hamlet is, for many, the greatest book ever written. Before it, characters were archetypes. Hamlet created modern psychology, a conscious, moral, contradictory character who understands that truth destroys and that action has a cost. Nothing like this existed before. That's why Akira Kurosawa decided to remind cinema what that meant with The Bad Sleep Well. Kurosawa made one of the most intelligent adaptations ever because he doesn't adapt the play literally, he hides it. He transfers Hamlet into a world of suits, offices, and corporate hierarchies and proves something brutal. The tragedy of the Danish prince works just as powerfully in a castle as in a corporation. The film begins like a dry, almost documentary thriller, but slowly transforms into a moral tragedy. Revenge here is not epic or liberating. It's slow, lonely, and corrosive. The protagonist hesitates not because he is weak, but because he understands the price of truth. Kurosawa strips away romanticism and keeps what matters: inherited guilt, power protecting itself, and the impossibility of defeating a system from within without destroying yourself. There is no ghost, but the past weighs on every frame. There are no theatrical monologues, but silence says, to be or not to be. Many modern films about corruption and revenge draw directly from this structure. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it signs contracts and sleeps peacefully. The Bad Sleep Well is not an obvious adaptation. It is Hamlet infiltrated into modern cinema, and once you see it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Chimes at Midnight does not adapt a single play. It adapts Henry IV, Henry V, Richard II, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. 4 texts, 4 tones, and yet Orson Welles united them into something unique: a single emotional tragedy. The film follows the relationship between a young prince destined for power and Falstaff, one of the most human characters ever created. A man excessive, free, and vital, living outside the rules and representing everything the adult world will eventually reject. This is not a story about kings, but about friendship, time, and loss. Wells understood something essential about Shakespeare: that his great tragedies are not just about power, but about what power destroys. Growth here is not a victory, it is a renunciation. To become king, one must leave behind laughter, loyalty, and forms of love that don't fit the throne. Cinematically, it is a wild work, fragmented editing, faces carved by time, and one of the most influential battle scenes ever filmed. But what makes it eternal is not form, but emotion. That universal feeling of having lived something beautiful and knowing it will never return. Falstaff is the ancestor of countless characters that came later: the abandoned mentor, the inconvenient friend, the past that gets in the way. And that shows just how much Shakespeare created everything. Macbeth is one of the most influential works ever written because it defined modern ambition. Before it, evil was external or embodied by a purely evil character. Shakespeare created the figure who destroys himself and loses his soul by desiring too much, power that corrupts even before it is attained, and guilt as inevitable punishment. Every rise and fall story comes from here. And if any work demanded an uncompromising adaptation, it was Roman Polanski's Macbeth. Polanski understood that this tragedy should not be filmed as epic, but as descent. There is no heroic grandeur or theatrical solemnity, only mud, blood, fear, and a world that feels corrupted from its origin. The film turns ambition into something physical, felt in bodies, silences, and glances that can no longer turn back. Power does not remove Macbeth's fear or desire. It multiplies them until they destroy him. Violence is not glorious, but clumsy, desperate, and increasingly empty. Polanski doesn't soften the text. He pushes it to its ultimate consequences, showing how every decision fractures those who make it. Visually, it is one of the most influential adaptations ever made, paving the way for all later cinema that sought to portray evil without romanticism. This version doesn't try to make Macbeth accessible. It does something more honest. It makes it unbearable. Because it understands that this story is not about kings or prophecies, but about people who, desiring from the ego, condemn themselves and lose their souls. The most famous Shakespeare adaptation is one almost no one knows is an adaptation. The truth is, we all grew up with Hamlet. The Lion King is one of the most brilliant Shakespeare adaptations ever made, precisely because no one perceives it as one. And yet it is entirely so. Disney took Hamlet and translated it into a universal myth for all audiences. The story is that of an heir marked by loss, exile, and guilt. A son who runs from his past, doubts himself, and must decide whether to accept who he is or keep fleeing. There are no castles, but there is a kingdom. No swords, but betrayal. No monologues, but one central question: flee or accept destiny. The parallels are clear and deep. Hamlet is Simba, torn between memory and responsibility. Ophelia is Nala, the pure and luminous figure. Claudius is Scar, embodying ambition, resentment, and the thirst for power. Mufasa is King Hamlet, absent yet guiding from above. Even secondary characters reflect the inner conflict: escapism, cynicism, denial of pain. What's extraordinary is that the film turns an existential tragedy into something accessible to all without draining it of meaning. Hamlet becomes a story about growing up, facing guilt, and understanding that the past doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. Visually, musically, and narratively, The Lion King proves that great stories depend not on tone, but on emotional truth, and that Shakespeare had already written the perfect template centuries earlier. Othello is one of the most devastating works ever written because it does not speak about hatred. It speaks about how ego and obsession disguise themselves as love and destroy everything. Here, Shakespeare went further than in Macbeth or Hamlet. Evil no longer comes only from ambition or doubt, but from something far more everyday and recognizable: insecurity, the inability to trust, the fear of not being enough. Othello is the tragedy of a man who confuses intensity and possession with love, and that is why he is vulnerable. Orson Welles' version understands this with absolute clarity. It does not turn the story into melodrama or film theater. It turns it into pure cinema. Fractured faces, devouring shadows, and spaces that close in as the protagonist's mind darkens. Welles films jealousy as a disease. There are no explanatory speeches, only glances, silences, and a constant sense of threat. Iago does not create evil. He activates it by pressing the exact wound with unprecedented coldness. Desdemona embodies pure love, the kind that does not suspect, does not demand proof, and is precisely what ego cannot return. The revolution of Othello is proving that no prophecy or tragic destiny is needed to destroy someone. Touch their deepest wound, and that is enough. Welles's film is harsh, fragmented, and deeply uncomfortable, but honest because it understands that this tragedy is not spectacular, but intimate, slow, and silent. Othello is not about impossible love. It is about how most people believe they truly love, when in reality it is ego in disguise. One of the cruelest and most human truths Shakespeare gave to cinema. We've already spoken about Hamlet, and that's because it is not just a literary masterpiece. For many, it is the absolute summit of human creation. No text has explored consciousness, morality, doubt, and inner conflict so deeply, and that is why it is almost impossible to adapt. Cinema can show actions. Hamlet lives in thoughts. That's why Kenneth Branagh's version is so important. It doesn't try to compete with the play or encompass everything. It does something smarter. It translates its essence into cinematic language, condensing and focusing the tragedy from within. Here, Hamlet is not a character declaiming ideas, but a human being trapped between what he knows and what he cannot bear to do. Doubt becomes physical tension, thought becomes weight, and time becomes a constant threat. The film understands something essential. Hamlet is not a revenge story, but a story of lucidity, of seeing too early what others prefer not to see. No adaptation can surpass Hamlet, but this one shows how far cinema can go when it respects the text, understands its spirit, and knows when to be silent. It is not the definitive work, it is the definitive adaptation. And that's why the two films that come next stand above the rest. They do not adapt Shakespeare, they use his perfect structure to create pure cinema. They do not compete with the plays, they create something different. In place of textual poetry, there is the direction of Akira Kurosawa. And for that reason, without debate, they are two of the greatest films in the entire history of cinema. Throne of Blood is more than an adaptation of Macbeth. It is the perfect translation of its spirit into the language of cinema. With this film, Akira Kurosawa understood something almost no one before him had grasped. That William Shakespeare, to be brought to the screen, does not need verse, monologues, or even words. What he needs is atmosphere, rhythm, and destiny. And that is precisely what cinema provides. The story is that of a warrior trapped between ambition and fear, driven by forces that seem to come both from the outside and from within his own mind. Power here is not desired with grandeur, but with terror. There is no glory in ascent, only paranoia. Every step forward is also a step toward ruin. Kurosawa removes verbal psychology and replaces it with pure image. Fog that envelops everything, silences heavier than any dialogue, spaces that seem to close in on the characters. The castle is not a place of power, it is a trap, and destiny is not announced with words, but with sensations. What makes Throne of Blood revolutionary is that it reinvents Macbeth without competing with it. Ambition is felt in the body, fear in the breath, guilt in every gesture. Everything is filmed like a ritual nightmare, where the characters do not move toward power, but toward their own annihilation. This film influenced all later cinema that sought to portray tragedy without romanticism, evil without epic grandeur, and destiny as something inescapable. Kurosawa reminded the world that our stories come from Shakespeare, and that his spirit must live on in cinema. Throne of Blood does not try to surpass Macbeth. It does something greater. It makes it eternal in another language. And that is why it is not just a masterpiece. It is one of the undisputed peaks in the history of cinema. Before moving on to the #1 spot, it's worth revisiting works that, while they do not adapt Shakespeare directly, exist because of him. There Will Be Blood is Macbeth, ambition devouring itself, the solitary rise, power as an inner curse. The Godfather is King Lear, the patriarch dividing his kingdom, the family as a battlefield, and the cost of confusing power with love. Tess is Romeo and Juliet, pure love crushed by an unjust world, where tragedy is born not from error, but from circumstance. And there are many more. If you start reading Shakespeare, an entirely new world opens up. Leave your favorite works in the comments, and I challenge you to guess mine. I'll give you a hint. You already know what my favorite film is. Now yes, let's go to #1. Ran is not just the best film based on Shakespeare. It is one of the greatest works of art ever created. Here, Akira Kurosawa takes King Lear and does something that seemed impossible. Not adapting it, but transcending it. The story of an old man dividing his kingdom among his children becomes a cosmic tragedy about power, ego, old age, and the collapse of everything human. It is no longer read, it is lived without betraying the original text. The film depicts the absolute collapse of an order that once seemed eternal. A man who confused authority with love, strength with wisdom, and control with legacy. From that moment on, everything is consequence. There are no heroes to save the disaster, no easy redemption, only the brutal realization that certain decisions, once made, cannot be undone. Visually, Ran is incomparable. Every frame feels like a condemned painting. Color, movement, and the use of space and silence turn the tragedy into something physical, almost ritualistic. The battles are not spectacle. They are chaos, dehumanization, and emptiness. Kurosawa does not glorify war or power. He reduces them to dust. What is truly revolutionary is that the film removes all consolation. Here, Shakespeare's text reaches its purest form. Evil is not a single villain, but a chain of human errors. Destiny does not fall from the sky. We build it ourselves, and when it arrives, it is already too late. Ran proves that cinema can stand alongside the highest literature, not by copying it, not by imitating it, but by speaking the same language through a different medium. That is why it does not compete with Shakespeare. It honors him by pushing him to the limit. And if there were still any doubts about Kurosawa's genius, he directed this film almost completely blind. It is no exaggeration to say he is the Beethoven of cinema. And that is why, without debate, Ran is the greatest film ever based on Shakespeare. Before closing, one final fact that sums everything up. William Shakespeare did not only write the stories that founded modern cinema. He created more than 1,500 words we still use every day. He invented modern psychology before psychology existed. And he understood the human being with a depth we have yet to surpass. It's not that cinema is inspired by Shakespeare, it's that cinema was born from him. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you want my next video to be. See you soon, here, where cinema reaches its highest form.